if you actually just had a couple of simple numbers that were being measured more often, your level of reliance on finance would go down dramatically because you would know what to expect on your P&L before you ever got it, because all the leading indicators would be things that you were much more aware of. Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. We've got another internal episode for you today, and I'm joined by the one and only Kristen Kelly from the consulting team. And today we're going to talk about where we see things headed in terms of how agencies are being managed, how we're managing profitability. So with all that, Kristen, why don't you go ahead and remind everyone who you are and tee up today's topic?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again, Marcel. I'm Kristen, and like Marcel said, I'm a member of Parakeeto's consulting team. I've been in the agency space for about 20 years and just a whole lot to say on this topic. So it's a really good one. I'm excited to dive in. So as Marcel mentioned, I think this is just like a really critical juncture here in agency life, particularly as we get into annual planning season. And it's just really more important than ever to be dialed into profitability and for that understanding to just be across functions. And I think the common story we hear and what I've seen at my previous agencies is that, we manage across silos. We treat sales, delivery, and finance like independent functions, and, they've got separate data sets. And the expectation really is that this is like a very linear data flow from one of those to the other, starting with, sales to delivery to finance, and then ultimately, there at the end of that linear line, we get the insights into profit. And that just truly plays out this time of year as we get into annual planning, right? We get into those meetings with leadership, and we see all different types of opinions and takes on what it takes to achieve a goal, where the goalpost should be, without really a true single source of truth or an anchor to have that conversation about what's possible. And what actually happens is usually we see teams default to finance there, that last point on the line, making the final calls on, what is the forecast? What are our targets? And everyone kind of creates these OKRs from there and just ladders back up to that. And you find yourself in Q1, Q2, your plan's breaking. Maybe we didn't have great delivery data. Maybe we didn't have sightline into utilization. All kinds of things can attribute to that. And it just can be really challenging. So this is a great conversation for today. I think, we're just at this transitional point where agencies have this real need for interconnectivity and a system, and just get out of this, siloed agency mentality. So that's what I'm looking forward to diving into today. I see you nodding your head a lot, Marcel.
Well, this is obviously something that I've been thinking about for a really long time. And only recently have, we've been working on trying to tell our story, have I been able to put better words to this. And this idea of the siloed agency, I think really brings together a lot of the challenges that we saw when we started this company. And I think are the result of the industry just kind of changing, right? This model worked for a long time. It's, I think, part of the reason why so much of the technology and the common knowledge and the ways that people have thought about this in the past, like why they're still often trying to force their business into this way of working. But things are different now, and it's become somewhat incompatible with the reality of most firms and how they're running today. And that creates this gap that, frankly, is the reason that we exist.
Yeah, completely. And so just to kind of further define the problem and paint the picture for everyone listening, what does, siloed agency life look like in the day-to-day to you? Like, what do you hear the most as the symptomatic type stuff?
So it's a number of things. And the fundamental idea here is that it kind of treats sales, delivery, and finance as these separate functions and assumes that, to your point, there's this linear flow of data. So the sales team goes out and sells things. which is often going to involve a scoping and pricing exercise. They then give that to delivery, who then figures out how to deliver those things. And then they kind of funnel all of that information into finance, who then tallies up all the ones and zeros and figures out how much money we made, how much time did we spend, what did it cost us, what were our margins. And ultimately, like historically, it's been seen as their responsibility to also then create this feedback loop on how are we performing from a profitability perspective. And they're also often mostly in charge of doing forecasting and setting targets and budgets and all of those kinds of things. And this is kind of based on the assumption that that is how the information flows through the business. And at a time when everything was time and materials billing, and that was like the dominant way of working, this actually worked quite well. In fact, it was somewhat necessary because you didn't really know how much money you made until accounting had a chance to tally up all the invoices. A lot of this was driven by time tracking data. So it made sense at that time for it to work this way. But the problem is, in a modern context where there's all kinds of different billing models, all kinds of different labor models inside of the average agency, I think the experience that people have running the business on a day-to-day basis is that actually these things are all interconnected and they're part of this like moving puzzle. That it means that, hey, something changed over here in delivery. We hired someone, we fired someone, we changed the time off policy, we moved somebody's role around. And that now has this cascading effect where it changes how finance should be looking at targets and budgets. It changes how sales and marketing should be looking at how their pricing and scoping work or what they're planning for. And it really takes a much more integrated approach to get a grip on these things and have a more dynamic way to maintain an aligned understanding of what are we capable of, what should our targets be, are we on track? Because these things are changing much faster than they ever have, and they're much more dynamic than they've ever been.
Yeah. And you mentioned time and materials and the shift away from that being one of the main drivers of this shift. And what else in your mind has changed about, the industry and really just even the economic landscape that is, is changing things?
I think one of the other big drivers is that there used to be this agency of record kind of mentality that a lot of agencies and clients would get into, where you're the agency of record. So you have, a handful of really big clients. Those accounts are quite large. They throw you all kinds of work. And there is a fair amount of consistency to that relationship. And so the amount of change that you were experiencing in terms of what you were selling, how you were billing for that, new clients coming on and leaving, there just wasn't as much of the, I'm going to say, high volume of change that you see in firms today, where they have to be much more nimble. They're often having a far higher turnover of clients. They're often changing their pricing and packaging much more often, changing what they're selling much more often, having to try to keep up with trends. The way that they deliver services is changing. And again, a lot of that is happening in the context of pricing models that are not necessarily creating an intrinsic link between time and money. And so the question of like, how much money did we make on this project, or how profitable is this thing, or how much capacity do we need, is still a function of dollars and hours, but it's not as simple of an equation anymore. And it's much more dynamic.
Yeah, and I think other contributing factors being, just overall agencies are having a more difficult time, I think, with new business as of late, and certainly the pressures on margin with just increasing salaries and how to deal with that. All of these being just recurring things that we hear over and over again. Yeah. And so what needs to be true for agencies to move into a more integrated approach here? How do they start? What does that look like?
Yeah. I think the first realization is that profitability management is a job that someone needs to do. And like it or not, there's always somebody doing it in the agency. They either don't know that it's happening, or they do know that it's happening, but they have no idea what they're doing, right? And so if you're listening to this, it might be you, but you might have somebody else on your team that they've kind of fallen into this role of saying, okay, my job is to try to sit in between new business and leadership, delivery and operations, and finance, and try to make sense of all of those things. And the practical application of this is, okay, we're going to have a leadership meeting and we're going to try to determine what our targets are for next year. What is our revenue target? And what kind of utilization or project margins do we need to accomplish in order to achieve that? What kind of budgets should we be setting for overhead spending? And if you've ever tried to do that exercise, you know that in that meeting, there's going to be a whole lot of what if questions, right? And so if you're using a kind of linear or siloed approach, probably what your process has to look like every time there's a what if question is you say, okay, give me a few days. Let me go back through this entire process and build another static scenario, because the framework that you're using is not interconnected. Whereas what I think everybody's trying to get to, but it's really, really hard to get to, is this more dynamic model where right inside of that meeting, you could say, oh, okay, ops wants to change the structure of the team. Let's make that change and see how it impacts finance and sales. Oh, sales wants to change the way that we're pricing things. Let's make that change and see how it impacts finance and delivery. And you can see the connection between these things because mathematically you've kind of created this model. That work is difficult, but I think it starts with acknowledging that an integrated approach is going to be more conducive to running the business in this modern context, and B, that there actually is a job, and it's probably a full-time job or a near full-time job, which is being the person that sits in the middle, makes sense of this, manages the data, builds the systems, maintains the systems, creates alignment between those different divisions. And it involves a lot of work and it involves a lot of nuance, and it's not an easy thing to do. And it's often something that people are being pulled outside of their kind of core competency to try and cover. So, I know you have experience being asked to step into that role from an operations perspective. We still see lots of finance professionals be asked to step into that role. And then we also see lots of CEOs that don't really have enough resources either in ops or in finance that they then have to step in and do that job. And it's a really tough situation to be in if you've never done it before.
Yeah. So, what would you say to someone who feels like the spreadsheet that they've built is actually serving the purpose of this? What's wrong inherently with a spreadsheet that someone has put together with data from finance and manually updating every month, let's say?
Yeah, I think the thing that they're probably running into, and look, I mean, if it's working for you, then it's working for you. Who am I to say that it's not working for you? But my guess, if you have this very kind of static way of looking at the business, is that there are a lot of conversations that are happening and a lot of decisions that are getting made that end up being based on gut because of all the friction that's required to get data to support that conversation. And our experience, and these are the kinds of conversations we have with clients every single month, is that when you're in a leadership role at an agency, you're generally making a lot of decisions based on probability. So I think this is one of the critical assumptions that are made when people are trying to build forecasts and trying to set targets and budgets inside of an agency, and using this very kind of bottom up mentality, is this idea, right, that like we're going to make a whole bunch of assumptions and that those assumptions are somehow going to be accurate. But the reality is that we can't predict the future. And so often the calculus that we're really having go on in our mind is, well, of these 5 or 6 different outcomes that could happen across these 5 or 6 different vectors, what are all of the places that we could land? What are all of the outcomes that we could have, right? It's one thing to say, oh, we're going to set a target utilization of 50%. But a more accurate way to have that conversation is, it's likely that we'll end up somewhere between 40 and 55%. So we need to be able to kind of look across all those different scenarios and then look at different ABR outcomes, look at maybe different staffing outcomes, look at different sales outcomes, and then aggregate all of those outcomes into some kind of probability-based set of decisions. And that is not very well supported by a spreadsheet that every time you want to look at one of those different variations on that scenario, you have to go spend a few hours updating it and then coming back with a static report. Like, it just doesn't help facilitate the conversation. So typically that's where I see the kind of traditional way of looking at this falling short.
Mm-hmm. What would you say the traps are when someone is, kind of just over reliant on finance or accounting to be giving them what they're calling an integrated view on this?
There's a number of them. But I think the biggest one is this idea that it all needs to connect together. And the thing about finance that we have to understand is that, especially when they're responsible for the core finance responsibilities, which would be tax, cash flow forecasting, compliance on different financial reporting requirements that you might have as a business, their first job is to be very precise and compliant around those things. And so what tends to happen is because they become the choke point for insight, then all of the data that you're giving them is being held to that same standard of precision. And you would think that that's a good thing, but actually what often ends up happening is you lose accuracy because of the precision that they're trying to hold all of this information to. And more importantly, you lose a lot of timeliness, where now, because everything is being tied to this like monolithic finance reconciliation process, you end up with insights every 30 or 45 days. They're often looking backwards. They're often 3 or 4 weeks after the month is closed, because everything is kind of falling to the level of timeliness that finance happens on because of the requirements that it has. But the reality is a utilization measurement or insight into project performance and project profitability, or an analysis of how average cost per hour is changing across different service lines or through the business. Like, these are all things that don't require nearly the same amount of precision and could be much more timely and can act as leading indicators to the financial outcomes that you would expect to see on the P&L. And so I think this is the big revelation for a lot of people, is like, if you actually just had a couple of simple numbers that were being measured more often, your level of reliance on finance would go down dramatically, because you would know what to expect on your P&L before you ever got it, because all the leading indicators would be things that you were much more aware of. And so I think this plays into, if we want to get into the tactics of how to actually start installing a more integrated approach in the agency, where we get into talking about the 3 elements being data, framework, and process, and where we can talk about the sequencing that we always go through, which is model, forecast, and then feedback loops, because you can actually get very, very far with very little investment and very little data if you just approach this with the right sequencing.
Yeah, so let's actually start there. How take me to the beginning of this sequence, the data, and then, really the modeling. And what is that first step for someone who's listening to this?
Yeah. So I'll just walk through, of course, what we do at Parakeeto. When somebody comes to us and they don't really have any of this in place, or what they have in place is not at all working for them, or maybe they're still using this siloed linear approach. When we think about, okay, let's start building your integrated visibility into the agency, the first question that we want to ask is, what's the highest amount of insight that we can get them with the least amount of data and the least amount of time invested? And so we always start with their model. And their model is this kind of idea that I was talking about before, where we have this model of the business where we can play with all 3 of those areas. We can look at operations and delivery, and primarily the structure of the team. So who's on the team, how much do they get paid, how many hours do they spend doing client work, how many hours do they spend doing other things, how much time off do they get. So that's really the model for the team. We can look at new business, which is really about average billable rate. So like, what kind of sales do we expect to make and how much do we expect to sell things for? And then we can look at financial budgets. What do we expect to be spending on payroll across different areas of the business and overhead expenses across different areas of the business? And we set up the model such that all of those things are interconnected. So we can now start playing with any of those variables and seeing how it impacts every other variable in the system in this big, beautiful mathematical equation. And the thing that's so beautiful about that is we can get it done so quickly, and it doesn't require any historical data, right? This is one of like the biggest concerns that people have when they speak to us. They go, oh, well, like, we don't have any time tracking, or we have time tracking and it's bad, or our books are a mess. And it's like, well, none of that matters actually, because the first thing we're going to do is take all of your assumptions about the business and structure them in a way where it becomes clear what the outcome of those assumptions are. And there's a lot of insight that we get from just doing that exercise. Often the insight is, oh, this business is not capable of accomplishing what we want it to accomplish. Well, that's a pretty important thing to come to the realization of, right? Because then it's like, no matter how perfectly everything goes, we're still going to feel like we're failing. And it turns out that that wasn't actually an execution problem. It was just a planning problem. We just didn't know it. So we always start there. We start with the model. That's where I would encourage everyone to start with, is start with the model. And that in and of itself can be such a huge benefit to just facilitating leadership conversations, because it helps align everybody and do so in a really dynamic, like real-time way. And importantly, helps give you a tool to facilitate that conversation on an ongoing basis. So that is step one. We start with, let's build the model, because it's quick, it's easy, it doesn't require a whole lot of information, but it can be really, really insightful. I'll pause there before I move on to the next one.
Yeah, you just highlighted, the illumination factor that we see when we have, clients that complete the model. Really, the two big points that I see clients just, really latch onto are, first of all, the AGI capacity. What can we actually achieve with this team? What is going to be a realistic target, and have it anchored? Again, the second point is, now I have this tool that I can manipulate however I need to at a very high level, from a payroll perspective, from an ABR perspective, and just kind of see whether the targets I have in my mind are realistic at all or not. And that's just such a powerful tool for leadership teams to have. Really invaluable.
And I love it so much because it takes all of the guesswork out of conversations like, should we hire a person or not? Or, what would it look like if we hired someone, fired someone, raised our prices, changed our utilization targets for the team, gave everybody an extra week of vacation this year, went to a 4-day work week? It's like, in seconds, you can just see exactly what that means. No one can argue with it. It's just math, right? And so how much more effective is the leadership conversation when all of that is just taken off the table, and then everyone can just look at the data and say, okay, this is what it means. Are we comfortable with that? What else could we do? What other things could we do to counteract this, or to make up for this extra time off, or whatever the case might be? And it creates much more alignment, which, from like underneath all of this, like if I think about why what we do is so important, it's not really about the data. It's about what the data does. And the alignment, to me, is the most important thing, because that's what leads to action on teams.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it.
Then what? It becomes really important to, apply that model to what's actually happening. And next at Parakeeto comes the framework and forecast. So let's dive into that.
Yeah. So once we finish with the model, the next thing that we do is we go into forecasting. So the nice thing is, if we've done the model properly, we already have a pretty good model of capacity. So the next step is for us to, generally, we install what we call role categories. And role categories are just a way to kind of segment people's capacity into one other level of granularity that's not individuals. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that's important. That's probably a whole other podcast episode. The big idea is, for some organizations, this might be departments or teams or different skill sets, right? And so we start to break down their capacity into those buckets. So as an example, we might break their team down into design, copywriting, engineering, project management. So we have a sense of, okay, this is our capacity across these different areas. And then we start layering in planned work. So all the existing projects and contracts that they have, and then we can start to look at stuff that's maybe in the pipeline, looks like it might close, and we are going to estimate all the time across those same buckets. So now we have a forecast, and that forecast can tell us a number of things. So the model told us, here's what we could achieve if everything went perfectly. And now the forecast tells us very easily, very, again, dynamically, which is important, what we can expect. How close or far are we from our utilization target? How close or far will we be from our average billable rate target? How close or far will we be from our agency gross income capacity, from our delivery margin, from our net profit target? We could see all of that in advance, and we can, importantly, maintain that forecast without having to wade through thousands of little individual task assignments to people, which is just like impossible to maintain. And again, in a meeting, we can sit down and we can go through scenarios very fluidly. What if we do get this deal? What if we don't? What if we do hire this person? What if we don't? And see what the probability of outcomes is. And again, this doesn't require any time tracking data. It doesn't require any historical financial data. This is, again, just about being more deliberate about structuring our assumptions. And now we're in this position where it's like we shouldn't be surprised by any of the outcomes on our P&L because we knew ahead of time if we were going to be on track to accomplish it or not. So that is the second step in the process. And again, we do it in this order because that's a lot of really important insight. And for a lot of companies, this is all they needed in order to massively improve their profitability, because their problem was that they were planning to fail and they just didn't know it. And there's no amount of tracking time or finances that's going to fix that problem. So we start with that low-hanging fruit. And then the last step that we'll get into is installing the feedback loop, so that if we're still not showing up on the P&L the way that we want to, then we can start to get an understanding of specifically why that is and know exactly where to focus to fix it.
Yeah. And one of the pieces of Predict that I also love so much is the estimator tool that also accompanies it. And I think that really just empowers agencies to kind of dial back to the project level and get a real understanding of what they're actually planning to profit off of each of each of their projects and everything that's scoped. We get a real sense with this tool of the unit economics of the work that they're actually planning to do. They can see very granularly what the ABR is, what their delivery margin is going to be. Again, a really powerful tool that can help solve some of those things at the root, and really just shine some more light on what you're actually seeing in the planned forecast. So I think, people that work with us really do, appreciate that level of granularity to start chipping away at some of the issues that the visualizations and the tooling showcase.
So there's another thing that we haven't really talked about here, but I think is important before we get into the last step, which is feedback loops. So that's when we start to pull in time tracking and finance data. And the thing that's so funny about this, right, is when people experience profitability issues, so many of them jump to the last step. They go straight to, let's start tracking time, let's start really like dialing in our finances, et cetera. And then they have this frustrating experience of like, okay, now we're collecting all this information, but we're still not really getting anything from it. Every time we pull time tracking from our time tracking tool, it's a mess. It's like we're just not really getting any insight from it, right? We hear this all the time. And usually the reason that has actually occurred is because they didn't sequence things this way. Because we've talked about, of course, all the reasons that you can get a lot of insight for very little and capture the low-hanging fruit. So that is part of the reason it makes sense to sequence this way. But the other thing that's really important is, how do you know what structure your time tracking and finance data needs to be in if you haven't done these other two steps? Because if we understand that the whole purpose of tracking time and financial data is to then have a way to compare what we thought was going to happen to what actually happened, so we can focus on the outliers. Well, starting with time tracking and finance is putting the cart before the horse. And so I think this is why people end up in this predicament over and over and over again, is that the sequencing was just off. So not only will you get wins faster and get incremental value, but then by the time you get to, okay, let's install or revamp how we do time tracking, you'll know exactly what the structure of that information needs to look like, because we've already worked through exactly what are our targets, what are the metrics that we're tracking, how are all of those calculated, when we sell something and scope something and forecast it, exactly how are we structuring all of those things, the planned hours, what buckets do those go into. So all the questions of like, oh, well, what should the task list in Harvest be? Or what should the naming convention for projects be? Or what should the tags for different services or products be? It's like you've already answered all of those questions because you went through this in a very deliberate way. So that's why we do that as the last step. It also happens to be, usually the longest and hardest part of all of this, and the most expensive, in terms of now you have to be constantly pulling and cleaning and transforming that data and making sure that structure stays clean, which is a job that I think a lot of people forget is going to happen. They just kind of assume like, oh, okay, once we install our time tracking and finance data, we'll just pull it, we'll zap it into a dashboard and it'll all be clean all the time. But the reality is that's just not the case. People make mistakes, things change. There's naming convention issues. There's going to be changes to tools. There's going to be changes to how the project management team wants to set their stuff up inside of the tool. And so you are going to still need to have a person who's responsible for keeping track of that data, cleaning it, making sure that it's in the right structure. And as things change in the business, making sure that falls in line with the way that we have set up the structure of data across the reporting system. So that's the kind of the three-step process: model, forecast, and then feedback loops, or, in the way that we do it, we call it assess the business model, predict with forecasting, and then optimize with feedback loops.
Yeah. And the system is so powerful. And I think where I want to realign us is then, once this integrated system is in place, how do you recommend that teams that do have, these separate functions still, interact with this integrated system, and how to get the most out of that? Obviously, you've got one person who needs to be the driver, but how does that all kind of play out from a team perspective?
So I'll answer this in a bit of a roundabout way, and I want to talk about the kind of three elements that are important, and hopefully this will be insightful for some people that are listening. When they try to go after this opportunity, there's three things that need to be in place, and we find that teams struggle with at least two of them. So the first is you have to have the data, right? So we've talked about all of the things that we want to be able to see. So there's a certain amount of data that's just required for that. You need to understand your people, pretty basic information about your people, how much they get paid, how much time they work, et cetera. You need to have some basic information about your projects, when they're happening, how much you're getting paid for them, how many hours you expect them to take. You need to have some basic information about finance, where's your money going, and be able to classify that into a couple of simple buckets. And you need to be able to understand where your time is going. And again, have a certain amount of metadata on that. That stuff is usually fairly straightforward. Very few teams are really going to struggle to get that stuff in place. There's tons of tools for it. Those tools cost next to nothing. So like collecting the data is not really the issue. Most teams are already doing that well. Where things start to break down is the other two elements, which are the framework. And the framework is really about being very, very deliberate about what metrics are we tracking? Exactly how do we calculate those metrics? Like, what is the specific formula, right? So like, how many times have we had discussions with a team about, okay, well, what exactly is our utilization formula? What is capacity? What's a billable hour? So figuring all of that out and being really, 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 really deliberate about it. And then the last thing is the relationships between both the metrics and the business. So the framework is a piece that a lot of people are missing. Now, the good news is the framework's free. We published it in our toolkit. You can go get access to it. You've probably already heard an advertisement for that during this podcast episode. But that's a really important piece. And even if you have everything else going on, if you don't have that nailed down, we see this all the time where it's like, hey, we're putting all this time and energy into measuring these things, and yet everything still kind of feels disconnected. It's like, okay, there's probably these little nuances about the calculations that you don't think are that important, but they're actually super material. And then the last piece is the process. And so this is where we get into the conversation of how is this information being utilized to support the team? So under process, we have kind of three elements. We have hygiene. So do we have a process for making sure that we get complete, clean, and structured data sets every time that we build a report? Because what we don't want to do is put bad data into a report, which creates a false sense of certainty around things that aren't real. That is counterproductive. It's actually worse than having no data. Bad data is worse than no data. The second thing is change management, right? We know that things are going to change. And so we should have a process to manage that change so that if the team wants to use a new time tracking tool, it doesn't put our reports out of commission for 3 months because it broke everything and we didn't see it coming. And then the third piece is cadences. So that's really working backwards from what are the conversations that are happening? Within those conversations, what kind of decisions or questions are being discussed? And then what information is being used to support that? And that will help us get clarity on, okay, what are the cadences for how often we need to have timesheets submitted and pull those and clean them and complete the update of a certain metric, and what time horizon do those metrics need to be measured on, et cetera. The standard cadence around this would be at least a monthly leadership meeting where we're looking at kind of the overall performance of the business, starting with core financials and then going down into the levers for those core financials, which are mostly utilization and average billable rate or project performance. And then you'll probably have on a weekly or bi-weekly cadence, more of a middle or depending on how many layers of management you have, but we'll call it a middle management cadence, which is much more focused on delivery and operations. And those are going to be focused more so on those delivery margin levers because those are sort of the leading indicators. So utilization and average billable rate. And that's pretty much it. I mean, to the extent that you can be paying attention to utilization and average billable rate, and those are on track, you pretty much know ahead of time that unless people are spending crazy amounts of money on overhead, we're going to end up in the right place on the P&L. So that's typically what we're seeing, and part of this is going to come down to what is the rate of change that's happening in this agency. Like if you do a lot of really big projects and things just don't change that much, you probably can get away with these longer time horizons in between meetings. But if you do like a lot of like really quick turn, high volume of small projects, then you might need to tighten up your meeting frequency because the rate of change is going to be a lot quicker. So part of that titration has to do with the nature of the business, but by and large, leadership can usually meet about monthly on the bigger picture stuff. And then delivery is going to be usually weekly or bi-weekly around some more specific operational metrics.
And all of this together is just such a powerful system. And I think it's important to kind of highlight the pretty relatively short time horizon that you mentioned earlier on the call that, this is accomplished in, particularly model, which, can be accomplished within about a couple weeks, from working with us to actually having all of that information at hand. But yeah, talk to us a little bit more about what it takes to actually install the full system.
Yeah, well, depends on what approach you're taking. If you're trying to do it yourself, I've spoken to firms that have been working on this for 3-4 years and they just still don't feel like it's coming together. But if like through our process, we can go from start to finish having the full optimized system installed and running in 6 to 8 weeks, pending scheduling challenges. And so if you think about that on the balance of like the opportunity cost, it's pretty massive. This is a thing that I laugh about a lot when someone's like, I think I'm just going to do this myself. I'm like, okay, great. Well, how long do you think that's going to take? I'm like, oh, I don't know. Maybe we'll have this done by the end of Q3. I'm like, okay, great. That's 9 months from now. And we understand that your profit margin is 10%, but it could be 30. So what is 9 months of 20% profitability plus the salary of the person that's going to be doing this, plus all the stuff you're going to spend on software, et cetera? What is that really going to cost you? Right. And it's like usually a lot more than what it would cost to just like guarantee solving the problem in a really short period of time. But what do I know? I'm just a guy trying to peddle my wares.
No, we have talked about this at great length, the opportunity cost of trying to do it on your own. And it's something I've seen firsthand. That's a 6-figure price tag and just definitely a longer time horizon than anyone should have to put up with when it comes to allowing profitability problems to persist. There's a much better way.
And of course, you have to risk adjust that too, where it's like, it's probably more expensive. Then you also have to factor in like, what are the chances that you actually get to the end of that 6 or 9 month period trying to work on building this thing and it is working exactly the way that you need it to, and it continues to work for a long period of time. And I don't know, I have this conversation hundreds of times a year. I have lots of people that I see go off and try it and then come back. I can't say that the success rate is very high, unfortunately. I wish that it was, but it's not.
Here we are. So, all right, TLDR, if you're going into 2025, feeling like you're really siloed, the integrated approach is a more intuitive way to go. What would be the step one, just one takeaway for someone to, action on right away, just to make 2025 a better year?
Well, step one would be go check out the Parakeeto toolkit, and there's free stuff in there. You don't have to give us any money. There's free stuff in there that will help you actually start to install an integrated approach in your business, in particular around the model of your business. So that experience we talked about earlier of being able to sit down with delivery, finance, and new business and be able to dynamically just look at all the different things that people are thinking about and want to try and the changes they're thinking about making. You can have that experience just by going and checking out the free stuff that we've published. And hopefully that'll give you a taste of what it feels like to do that. And of course, in the toolkit, there'll be lots of educational material to teach you in more detail how to start thinking about running the business in this way and looking at it through this lens.
100%. I encourage everyone to go check it out.
Free stuff. Who doesn't love free stuff?
All right. Thank you so much, Marcel. This is a great conversation.
Thank you, Kristen. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. And for those of you listening at home, let us know what you took away from this. If you have any questions, we always love to hear from you. Kristen and I are both on LinkedIn, and that's a great place to reach out. So send us a DM. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and we appreciate you tuning in. We'll see you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.